Call in. So whatever. Hello and welcome to another edition of Public Affairs Public Access. I'm your guest host, David Hutzelman, and this is a show where we talk about politics, political philosophy, and public policy issues basically from a libertarian perspective. And I have a couple of guests here tonight that are well qualified to do that. Tonight, we're going to be talking about things going on in the city of Houston. But in general, when I say I'm talking about something from a libertarian perspective, people ask me, what in the world is a libertarian perspective anyway? And I try to tell them, well, the libertarians are trying to create a big tent of a political following, and we're in favor of much less government, a free market economy, not the crony capitalism, over-regulated society that we live in today. And we're generally supportive of choice of lifestyles and freedom of expression and freedom of speech in today's phenomenon that we're seeing so acted out on the media stages these days. And a fairly non-interventionist and tolerant foreign policy where we don't think American military might is the right solution to everyone's problems around the world. So there's all kinds of libertarians. Some of them don't even want to participate in the political process because they think that's using force against other people, and other people actually are members of the Libertarian Party. So there's all sorts of flavors, and a lot of them are classified as libertarian conservatives even. So we have some issues, especially economic issues, and public policy issues in concert with conservatives. And so tonight I have two well-qualified gentlemen to speak about issues as they are emerging and developing in the Houston political scene. And they are, on my right, Charles Blaine. Charles is a political science graduate from Farley-Dickinson, and he is the Houston representative and prolific and articulate writer for EmpowerTexans.com, which is published so often that I can barely read one issue before the next issue comes out. But welcome, Charles.
Thank you.
And also joining us tonight is Don Hooper. Don is an executive in the energy business in Houston, and he's also a contributor to a blog known as BigJollyPolitics.com and a frequent commentator on the Houston political scene, and both from ballot issues and election issues standpoint. So tonight we're going to try to focus our show around the issues that are surrounding Houston from a public policy standpoint right now. And I think we'll probably start off with what is going to be what we think is going to be on the Houston ballot this fall for people to vote on, two public policy issues as it relates to bond issues and the financing of the city of Houston for certain provisions that we're going to talk about. So that's what we're going to spend the most of the time on, and we'll diverge into maybe some other topics as well. Let me remind our listeners at home, there's a call-in number, so if you have anything you'd like to bring up with the two gentlemen here tonight or myself, please give us a call, and we'll interrupt whatever conversation is going on and try to take care of your question. So let me just start off. Maybe I'll ask Charles to tell us what are the give us a brief overview of the issues, the bond issues that are going to be on the Houston ballot this fall. And then I'm going to ask Don to tell us what other issues that we thought might be on the ballot didn't make it. So go ahead, Charles.
So we have a number of bond issues this fall on the ballot. The kind of big one that everybody's been talking about is the $1 billion pension obligation bond issuance. And that comes from the pension reform And I want to put some quotations around reform because I don't think I don't think that's the best explanation for it. But the pension reform deal that the city passed through the state legislature this most recent session. So with
Sylvester Turner's bill.
Right. Sylvester Turner's bill to kind of rein in some of the pension spending and issue a lot of money to kind of buy down some of those unfunded liabilities. So we have the $1 billion pension obligation bond that voters will be voting on, and then we have $490 million in just general obligation bonds that are going to be going to things like police and fire departments and libraries and municipal multi-service centers and things like that. And they haven't decided exactly on the ballot language yet. They voted to place it on the ballot, but what they're saying is that it's going to be 5 different propositions for that specific $490 million, and then there's going to be one for the $1 billion. So it seems as though they're going to kind of spread it out a little bit so you can pick and choose. That's it. Who knows if they're going to hold true to that when it comes time to vote on ballot language, which I think is next week. But yeah, so that seems to be what it's shaping up to be right now. It's the big $1 billion one, and then $490 million in general obligation bonds that we're going to be using to do some improvements around the city.
And what are the issues that we've been reading about most of the year that didn't make it to the ballot? Even though I know there's been some pretty focused petition drives to collect the necessary signatures.
Yeah, there was a very professional petition drive that was done by Wendy Grimes and a group that came together to focus an issue, to put forth on the ballot the defined contribution, as opposed to the defined benefit system that the current city operates under.
You want to tell us a little bit about the difference for our viewers that may not?
Sure. So defined contribution is your typical 401k that everybody, I think, in the private sector is familiar with. The defined benefit is just a straight payment made by the city to the city unions for their retirement, and
based on some contributions they've made, though, right?
Yeah, the employees do contribute. That number has shrank enormously, I would say, over the last 20-year period, but over the last 10-year period, it has gone down. It's very small. I think it's like 9 or 10%, but I could be wrong about that. And the reform package seeks to correct some of that. Okay. And but I guess the most interesting thing about it is that the city secretary was unable to count the signatures on the petitions for the petition that was turned in on April, and later the firefighters did a petition to give them parity in pay with the Houston Police Department, which was unable to be counted as well. And so, I always find it amazing that boy, when the city of Houston or Stephen Costello has a charter amendment that he wants to do to impose a rain tax, boy, Anna Russell could count those.
I remember I've worked on several petition drives, and we got them in July, and there was no problem in getting it. I'm just surprised that in April, I mean, that's like 5-6 months that Anna had to do those petitions.
Anna Russell has always been a fairly straight shooter, and certainly the one petition drive that really burns in my memory is the one that was so heavily litigated and contested was the red light cameras, and there was and then of course the marriage equality.
Hero that was heavily litigated as well, and both of those recounts were the signatures were contested in those and litigated by the city. But in the end,
which they eventually lost, right?
Yes, they created what was called the Houston Rocket Docket with the Texas Supreme Court, and the Texas Supreme Court would routinely, look at what the city was doing and overrule them very, very quickly. And I think they got a little tired of it because they behaved themselves pretty well, and I was really surprised to see that neither one of these were litigated as well. Now
so there's not a chance. There's not really a possibility that somebody from the judicial branch is going to step in and make some decision because they haven't even been pursued?
I think that the people, so all of this costs money. And to litigate these type of things, I know that when the Kubashes litigated the red light cameras, it cost them over, I think it wound up costing over $1 million. I know over $750,000 in litigation cost on that alone. So I don't think that Wendy Grimes' group ever intended to litigate it. They cut the deal with Dan Patrick and those guys and Sylvester Turner at the legislature. Were happy with the way it turned out. I was not, and and they just chose not to, litigate whether or not the
Even though they presumably had the number of signatures necessary.
Yeah, it was. From my understanding, it was done by a very professional organization that it routinely does this, and they were done, to city standards and to the city form that they use that has been litigated time in memoriam at this point, so everybody's very familiar with it. And I think that they gathered those signatures very quickly, professionally, and it was turned in back in April, and Anna Russell was still counting them. And then the firefighters came up with theirs after they had lost their fight at the state legislature and also gathered very quickly their signatures. And I did have a conversation with one of their representatives, and he told me he was so excited about it. I said, well, what are you going to do about the fact that Wendy Grimes is sitting in front of you? And Anna Russell they hadn't even thought of that at the point. But, I think that, the city council, has let it be known that neither one of those petitions are going to make it to the ballot for voters to vote on.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Sort of a frustration of democracy there.
Yeah.
What you said there's some other bond issues going to be on the ballot, Charles? Did you say something about HISD?
So not bond issues, but we are looking at other just kind of election options, if you will, that are going to be on the ballot. So there are 3 open HISD seats. So they're district seats, so we'll each see one of them, and then there's a few who are up for re-election. So we're going to see those too. So there is, there are some actual elections that are going to be taking place, which are going to be interesting because the HISD seats, 2 of the trustees actually resigned, and they were 2 of the more conservative members of the board, so that's going to be interesting replacing those. And then you have the 1 seat that was vacated by Manny Rodriguez, who passed away a few weeks ago, kind of suddenly, and they temporarily appointed someone to fill that term, not to fill that term, but to sit in that place until they can call a special election, which is now going to be in November. So those are 3 kind of wide open seats, and typically HISD elections are, I don't want to say ignored, but they're not as they're not as popular as City of Houston elections or even Commissioners Courts elections and things like that. But I think this one is kind of very crucial because the state, the HISD, the district, is facing a potential takeover from the Texas Education Association, and they would install a board of managers if they can't get some of the failing schools above grade and things like that. So I think this election's going to be very important to determine who is on that board and the course that HISD is going to take moving forward. So yeah, there are a few other ones that are going to be on November's ballot that are going to be pretty interesting and I think very important, for the course of City of Houston voters in the future.
Very good. Okay, so we will have some decisions to make.
Yeah.
Let's go back to pension obligation bonds. We're talking about a $1 billion bond,
Yeah.
which is going to put $1 billion in Houston city coffers to do with what they think is right. I guess I was under the impression that a lot of the pension obligation bonds that are being passed around the country, some very perverse kind of mechanics are at work. You can actually go out and borrow more money and have your debt rating improved in terms of the overhang that your pension fund has.
I think that's wishful, liberal, fiscal thinking.
Is that what that is?
I can't imagine any fund manager or any professional money manager would think borrowing money is going to help your situation. But, as we've previously spoken about this, when you are borrowing money to pay for a debt you couldn't afford in the first place, it is a problem.
Yeah, that's
It's a big problem.
And I think what's
I
funny.
thought. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I think what's funny about the issue is that it's actually not funny, it's kind of deceptive. That they, during the pension reform deal, they kept saying, we're going to pass $1 billion of pension obligation bonds, and it's going to give us $2.5 billion of reduction in unfunded
Yeah,
liabilities.
that's what the.
And, it's. In
How does that happen?
In theory, yeah, you're buying down the unfunded liabilities, but we're taking on an extra $1 billion of debt, so we still have the same amount of debt. The way they try to frame it, and then they frame it as though it's going to look so much better to our creditors that we're not going to get downgrades and things. But it's always been just such a false argument to me that this $1 billion, they tried to say this $1 billion is paying down debt that we already owe, so therefore it's not really adding any new debt, but it is. It's just a new form of debt. We don't. It may not be more, and it could be if we end up having to pay more, depending on how our returns come in. But it's a new form of debt, and we're still within the same amount of debt that we have to pay down. Just kind of now it's just divided between different people that we're paying it down. So I'd kind of take issue with that. The argument that the city has always made that this isn't new debt that we're taking on. I definitely think it is. I think anytime that you're passing a referendum for any amount of money, whether it's $1 or $1 billion, you're taking on some sort of liability there.
I thought the rationale, maybe not for the bonds in Houston, but was the fact that if you could get the taxpayers to give you $1 billion, you could invest that money and make, instead of the 5% that you had to pay the taxpayers, you could make 7 or 8%, and therefore you would be paying down your obligations. But maybe that's not the way it's going to work in Houston, Don?
Well, no, and you see me laughing and smirking because forever we've heard from our unions, the police, the fire, and the Houston Municipal Employees Union, that they don't want to go to defined contribution because they don't want to risk the investment risk. But now they want.
Well, if you have a guaranteed benefit of 8% a year, I mean, I can see why.
And so now they want $1 billion to invest. And so it's, I'm just like, okay, run this by me again one more time, because, and if you really think so, of the $1 billion, and I should say this about the $1 billion, the $1 billion represents the largest bond by far and away ever sold by the city of Houston. And it's being sold as a pension obligation bond, which is very critical in the financial world. People have shied away from pension obligation bonds for 20 years just because you're borrowing a debt that you can't afford to pay in the first place. So you're just creating more debt. Now the city's position is that we owe, and by the way, so of the $1 billion, $750 million is going to the Houston Police Department, or the Houston Police Department pension fund, and $250 million is going to the Houston Municipal Employees Pension Fund. And by far and away, the worst of those two is the Houston Municipal Employees, which I think has a funding ratio of 43%. So they have an unfunded liability of close to 60%. There's not money to pay that has been promised to those retirees. The Houston Police Department, I think, is above 80. I think they may be 83%. But here's the interesting thing. There was an article in the Houston Chronicle 2 weeks ago involving a Houston oil company that has always gone out and gotten investors to invest in their investment drilling programs. This Houston oil company has had several funds, and it was identified when they had to liquidate one of their funds that the Houston Municipal Employees was a participant in that fund, and they lost $10 million. The first thing that I said, being in the oil and gas business, that what in the world are the Houston Municipal Employees doing investing in shale plays? Because that's all this company does. And made me really think about, okay, if it's 43%, they're getting $250 million, what is it really? what are their private equity investments we don't know about? We know about that one because it was reported and they wrote it down. But are there others like that? And I tend to think that there are, both for the Houston Municipal Employees and the Houston Police Officers Fund. And once they sell this $1 billion, they're going to come back and say, God, we've had some really bad mistakes in our investments and they're not what they're supposed to be. And they're going to be right back at us asking for more money.
Well, isn't that a consequence of the fact that those pension plans were basically on the hook to deliver at 8% a year?
There's no question they were chasing yield.
Yeah, I mean, if you can invest in municipal bonds and other safe investments and only getting 3 to 4%, and you've got an obligation at 8%, you're going to have to take some more risk in order to up that yield, right?
Right, and there had been criticism in the Houston local investment community that the Houston Municipal Employees and both the Houston Police Department were chasing yield to make up for some of their losses. Well, whenever you do that, you're upping the risk.
Sure.
And being in Houston, I'm sure they looked at some of these returns from these oil companies and went, we want some of that,
Yeah, right.
especially, when oil had gone, up to $107 a barrel. And that was one of the funds that they invested in at the top of the market that went sideways for them. But again, I question, we don't know anything about the finances of either one of these funds, and we're being asked to pay $1 billion into them, not knowing what their real financial condition is. And all of this was cut, this deal was cut both at the state legislature led by Dan Patrick and Sylvester Turner, and here in Houston with the Houston City Council. And nobody in that whole conversation asked them, okay, is this the only $1 billion we're going to have to give you? Are we going to be giving you billions of dollars in the future? Is this it? What is the condition of your fund? Nobody asked those questions. And I think there's a couple of things driving this. And one of the things driving this is that Kim Ogg got elected as our district attorney, and Sylvester Turner came in and hired Art Acevedo, and there was a group of police officers, a very large group of police officers, senior officers, who didn't want to work for them. Well, they have very large drop accounts. They all exited at the same time.
What's a drop account?
A drop account is called, it stands for the Deferred Retirement Option Plan. And it was created back in 2001, curiously enough, by Sylvester Turner and John Whitmire and Mario Gallegos, Senator Gallegos, that basically said that if you were a Houston police officer and you had 20 years of service, or a firefighter or a Houston municipal employee, you had 20 years of service, you could retire, put in your retirement papers, and continue to stay on the payroll at your full salary, and all of those retirement benefits would go into a drop account accruing at 8% a year. Well, that is the $10 billion unfunded, $11 billion, $12 billion, whatever the number is, unfunded liability. You heard often talk about it, are all these drop accounts that have been created by doing this, and they're enormous. And I've, senior police patrol officers retiring with over $1 million, close to $2 million in their accounts. And you quickly figure out, you have several hundred of them retiring at once. That's where the need for the $1 billion comes. And the question is, how many more people are behind them? How many, is this the end of it? None of those questions have been answered. None of those questions were even discussed.
Okay. Did Dallas have to address some of these similar issues?
Well, Dallas's fund, there was a run on their fund. And they, their mayor saw that the police officers were drawing down on their drop accounts in a way that he knew it was going to bankrupt the fund. The mayor personally walked into a federal courtroom and tried to get an injunction from the police officers to, as a taxpayer, to stop them from doing this. Before that judge could act, the board suspended payments. So it froze the accounts, which is a technical default. So Dallas has defaulted on that, their payments. And so you have to think about it. So you've got the retirees that are sitting over here who never had a drop account. So the older retirees, there's several different groups here. There's those retirees that have a partial drop account. There's the retirees that are coming on that are going to have a full drop account. So there's many categories. Now, interestingly enough, in Dallas, there's, of course, all of this exploded into litigation because you had those that got out with their full drop payment and those that didn't. Well, those that didn't sued. And the city of Dallas is in a world of hurt. But interestingly enough, as you compare it to the city of Houston, the city of Houston's about Dallas did their drop account about 8 years before the city of Houston did. So they're 8 years more in trouble than we are. That's kind of what triggered this. And, but I do think that we have a similar problem, and I do think that there is a run on the accounts, and that's why the need for this billion-dollar bond out of nowhere. And the city's argument is that we owe this money to the police officers, we owe this money to the Houston municipal employees, and it's a debt. Well, technically it is a debt. It was promised to them by politicians who received endorsements from these unions to get elected, and funding and campaign contributions. And so it is a debt that's owed to them. So the question is, to the people that are going to vote on this bond, do we convert that debt that's currently unsecured as a promise by these politicians to pay to a secured debt, which would be the billion-dollar pension obligation bond? That's probably, in my way of thinking, the best way I can put that analogy out there.
Okay.
I think Don brings up a good point. You know, with these accounts, we don't know what's in them. We don't know where they stand. It's hard to say that we're going to fund them with $1 billion when we don't know what condition they're in and what the future could hold with them. And you know, ORIC and the bond buyer held a joint panel this week on pension obligation bonds and how cities have a growing reliance on them to pay down unfunded liabilities. And what they mentioned is that, you know, while they kind of endorsed this method as long as there's other pension reform efforts being pushed, you know, San Bernardino, Stockton, Puerto Rico, and Detroit all, and their ultimate demise was because of pension obligation bonds. While, you know, unfunded liabilities were the contributing factor, the end came because of pension obligation bonds and having to pay those debts back to these bondholders, and that's what the problem was. So I think, you know, when we're coming up to November and we're looking at this, we're voting on $1 billion. I think it's a major question that people have to ask themselves, because, you know, there have been people, and I think Don, I've also said it too, that, you know, the city could just look at bankruptcy now. But when you pull in $1 billion and then you have to start considering that in the future and what happens if they can't pay that back and all these kind of other things that compound into it, and then if they ask again for more pension obligation bonds to continue to pay it down, you run into this area where the future is kind of undetermined and you don't know what's going to happen. The one benefit that maybe a few, but the kind of one victory I consider in this pension reform deal was that it allowed Houston taxpayers to vote on pension obligation bonds, and now that makes us the only city in the state, unless there's a smaller one that I can't think of, but the only city in the state that allows its voters to vote on pension obligation bonds. So that is a benefit. We'll at least have that going forward. But, you know, it is a big deal. It is a big deal, and it could really put the future in jeopardy and into play as to what's going to happen.
Well, that's interesting. I noticed in one of these articles that was fairly critical of pension obligation bonds, there was some Nobel Prize winner in economics said pension obligation bonds are like borrowing money to go to Las Vegas and gamble with. Is that
For your mortgage.
Is that true, or
for your mortgage money?
Charles, is that true? And also, what's going to happen if the voters in Houston turn this pension bond down.
Yeah, well, I would say in a lot of instances it is like going to Vegas and gambling, and you're like Don said before. What is the point in taking out more debt if you can't pay the debt that you have now? If you can't pay that, then why are you taking out money to then loan to that to then pay that back? I mean, it makes no sense. It doesn't make financial sense to me. And if they fail, it is kind of that also puts the future in jeopardy. I mean, right now it could go either way. If they pass, it could be bad. It could be good. If it fails, my personal opinion is that it might not be the worst thing, because it allows us to kind of reform what we're doing and figure out another option. It forces us to figure out another option. But if it fails, the two pension boards that are actually affected by the $1 billion, the police and the municipal employees, can walk away from the pension reform efforts that were passed in the state legislature. They're just allowed to disregard them. There was an opt-out provision placed within the bill that said that if the city failed to deliver on that $1 billion, they could walk away from it, and they don't have to accept those cuts. The firefighters, unfortunately, they didn't get that option because they're not getting any of the $1 billion, but the police and municipal employees can walk away from that. And we're going to kind of go back to pre-reform levels. So
what's the avenue for those pension boards if they opt out of the deal?
If they opt out of the deal, they're just going back to what their benefit
with all the
levels
unfunded liabilities.
Right.
And
That's all. That's just going to revert back to the way it was
bankrupt
before.
or something.
I mean, essentially, we're back in the same position we were in say January before this all dealt, and it was a very crucial, critical time for the city where they were trying to figure out how we were going to move forward, and that's what would happen again. Is we would go back to that position. We would have, I guess, technically there would be some cuts because firefighters would still be. Would still be locked into the provisions of the plan, so those cuts would remain in place, but everything else would go back. So we would have to kind of move forward and figure out how we could do that. And I think it would force us to go back to the drawing board and come up with substantive pension reforms that are actually going to do the job that we want them to do. Reduce these liabilities and reduce the amount that we're paying into them going forward by switching the pension systems that we're on. I mean, that's what most of us have advocated for from the beginning, was a complete flip of what we're doing from defined benefit to defined contribution, and that was left out of this bill. So I really think it would force that conversation again. But yeah, it would be a very precarious position if this doesn't pass.
Don's voting no. And let me tell you why I'm voting no. I'm voting no because one thing, the only reason why we're having this conversation about the $1 billion was because Sylvester Turner wanted to do, as all of the other mayors have done, is to continue spending money he didn't have. And Anise Parker did the same thing. She kept kicking the can down the road on this issue. Bill White before her, Lanier before White, and on and on. It has been, and what Sylvester Turner is attempting to do is the largest kick the can down the road you can possibly do with this $1 billion bond. But the $1 billion bond does not, if the bond failed, we still owe the police officers. We still owe them. It's how do we pay them? Now we could actually probably go back and say, well, the 400 people over here sitting in public works twiddling their thumbs, not doing anything, let's get rid of them. And when I say that because I know that the Public Works group for the county, who has the exact same road miles as the city of Houston, almost the exact same road miles for the unincorporated area of the county, does the same amount of work with 500 people that 4,000 people do at the Public Works Department. And so Sylvester Turner just wants to keep this huge government bureaucracy. I mean, we've got people in charge of left door handles down there, and it has been that way for a very long time. And he would actually have to cut spending instead of raising our taxes to pay for these bond obligations.
What about the issue that even if the bonds pass, that the city of Houston cannot actually spend the money to solve the pension crisis unless they can repeal the revenue caps that are already sitting on their
Well, that's the
budget?
debt. That's the debt portion. And so there was always this great talk, and the viewers must understand that the Houston Police Officers Union runs the city of Houston. You think it's Sylvester Turner. Sylvester Turner wants you to think it's him, but it's really them. And they were the ones that forced this issue at the state legislature for this $1 billion bond. And Sylvester had no choice other than to go along with it because they all supported him for office and they gave him a lot of money. All three unions did, including the fire department. And so this is their payback. And it is, I mean, I don't even know how to describe it to the viewers. You are going to be asked to pay a $1 billion bond that doesn't go for one school, one road to be built. It is just a money transfer from the taxpayers of Houston to the employees for their drop accounts. And some of the drop accounts are in the millions of dollars.
And I want to kind of piggyback off of something Don said in his previous answer, was that about, Sylvester Turner wants to keep the status quo. It's not that he has to. There was a lot of talk during the legislative session and after that he couldn't force a defined contribution plan because the support wasn't there. The unions didn't want it. He couldn't do this. It's not true. I mean, he's the mayor of the fourth largest city in the country, the largest city in the state. He had the power to put a seat into the legislature's mind what he wanted and had them push for it. I mean, we've seen other major cities do this. Philadelphia did it in the 90s. Ed Rendell quite literally told the police and fire unions, and I think the garbage union, that if they didn't want to take whatever pension cuts he was making, they can go ahead and strike, and he's going to privatize all those industries and get folks to come in. If Turner wanted to make a threat like that and wanted to really push their hand, he could have done that. Even recently, San Diego, I think his name is Kevin Falconer, the mayor there, he's made a massive overhaul of their pension system, and I think they're the 10th largest city or something like that. So Turner could have done this. He just didn't want to because, like Don said, he got a lot of money and a lot of support from these unions, and he's counting on that and whatever it turns out to be, however many years until re-election, whether it's 1, 2, 3, who knows at this point, with the lawsuit and everything. But he's counting on that support again, and he's trying to curry favor and ensure that they're still on his side and deliver this massive amount of money so that they're happy and all this kind of stuff. But he could have forced everyone's hand and brought in some substantive reforms, and he didn't do that.
Okay. Well, all right. Is there any organized opposition to this bond issue? Or, it's taxpayer representatives we're looking for, right? I guess.
Haven't seen any. And I think it's a very complicated issue. I've heard the position from the people that promulgated all of this is that this deal was cut with our lieutenant governor, who received Dan Patrick received millions of dollars from the HBOU over his years when he ran for the Senate and now the lieutenant governor. Same with the governor. The HBOU is a huge contributor to the governor. It's just not Sylvester Turner. This thing was great. You got to think about it. We just had a special session. Where 5 things of the governor's wish list got through, I think signed. Ultimate, was it 5 or 4?
I think 5.
5 things were signed on his 20. Sylvester Turner, the lieutenant governor, and the governor got Turner's deal through in the regular session. There was no question, and they knew this was going to come up. They knew that, that the legislature was going to blow up in the end, and they did not want this legislation sitting out in the back. Dan Patrick made sure this, that the city of Houston was going to be paying this $1 billion for his friends that have lined his pockets for years. And, it was put at the front of the regular session. It was passed out. And then the legislature blew up in the end. I think this was the fewest amount of bills passed out of any legislature in 20 years. It may have been 30 years. But the interesting thing about it is, by the way, I think that's a good thing. If they're not passing bills, that's a very good thing. Our forefathers were very smart to only let them meet every other year. I would go for every 4. So they do a lot of damage when they meet. They cost taxpayers a lot of money when they meet. And it is a very, very sad thing to look at the power and control that the unions really do have over this occurrence that the city of Houston is about to vote on. And this, you are about the city is about to be inundated with, you know, the worst language you can ever imagine from the Houston Police Department. If you don't pass this bond, you know, you're going to get murdered in the street. Your kids are going to be molested. I mean, it is going to be brutal what they're going to tell people what's about to happen if they don't give them this money. Not that I can get the Houston Police Department to respond, and actually they did respond to me today on an issue. If that had anything to do with it. but the, you know, it's very, very difficult to get the Houston Police Department to come out and, you know, investigate a car burglary. It's very difficult to get them to investigate a car theft, a home burglary.
Why is that?
I think, and well, actually I know, that the reason is that if you think about the way the drop program has been put in place, for all these years, you've had all of these officers in 2001 that were eligible to retire then, who have realized that they could amass this huge fortune in their drop accounts. This is in addition to their regular retirement. So they retire at 95% of their pay plus this drop account. If you were a Houston police officer and you saw this thing was growing millions of dollars, would you retire?
Yeah, probably not.
Right, and so that's what happened. So the idea was to encourage them to make money, to do all these things, but what really happened is we have a very old police department. I think the average age of a Houston police officer is 45 years old. They don't have to patrol after 40 if they don't want to. I think 40, maybe 35. And, you know, they have all these weird work rules and lots of vacation. And so as our police department aged, less and less time has gone to solving crimes, putting people in jail, all the things that we think.
Well, why is there no reason that somebody, just because they're older, they shouldn't be out solving crimes?
Well, I think it's because of their vacation and everything
I see.
else.
Okay,
That it's not like they have all these new hires that don't have any vacation, and they have senior positions. I think people in Houston would be really frightened to know how many Houston police officers are actually out patrolling the streets. It's very few, and it's scary. It's scary for your protection. You know, God bless the Texas legislature for allowing concealed carry. I carry a gun, and for my protection, I'm not dependent on the Houston Police Department.
Interesting. Okay.
I could go on and on about this, but
No, tell us how you really feel about this time. So, I guess, Charles, you've been hanging around in Austin some.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Okay. What, weren't there a number of other issues that people thought were going to happen? I know I have a sister who's a retired teacher. You know, she's very unhappy about what's been going on with the legislature and all, and I think there's some other issues that presumably were high-profile issues that didn't seem to get any movement on them. What are they, and what can you give us a brief overrun about what that means?
Sure, and it's you know, it kind of goes to something that Don said, was that it's amazing that Turner came in there with his pension bill during the regular session and got that through before, well, I think pretty far before they ended the session, and then the session ended without, you know, the Privacy Act, which has gained a ton of support over the past, I don't know, 2 years, ever since the HERO kind of thing went down in flames. They've started talking about a statewide Privacy Act, and then you have property tax reform, which was the biggest thing that everybody seemed to want. Everybody could kind of get on the same page with that, except all of the cities who opposed it, and you know, that involved like spending caps and decreasing the rollback rate, so that, you know, people had a right sooner to petition to kind of roll back any property tax increases that are, you know, over a certain amount, but that didn't go through. Union dues reform, which is another huge one. All these are priorities of the governor, and I'm not sure about the lieutenant governor, but one of the priorities of the governor, union dues reform was another one. It passed the Senate, didn't get out of the House. Most of these issues that Governor Abbott wanted, if not all of them, flew through the Senate. I mean, the Senate was working during the special session. They were working around the clock, getting everything in and out because they wanted to. They were there to work, and then they started taking up other things after that. But the House is what kind of stalled everything. Union dues reform had been filed, kind of day one of special session and didn't get a hearing at all. It was passed in the House probably within the first 2 weeks of the special session, and passed in the Senate within the first 2 weeks of the special session, then sent to the House. And the House just didn't refer it to committee, referred it to committee, then it wasn't brought up for a hearing. Neither the House version or the Senate version were brought up for hearings, so you kind of ran into issues like that. But yeah, there were major reforms that people wanted that, not only the Republican Party of Texas platform had, kind of enshrined these things, but Abbott made them priorities. Patrick made them priorities. They were supposed to go through this time around, and they just kind of got stalled again, as always, by the Speaker, Speaker Strauss, and his kind of governing coalition of folks, Byron Cook and Dan Flynn, and even my state representative Sarah Davis, and all of these people who he kind of works very closely with to facilitate his agenda. I mean, these things stood no chance, really. So it's frustrating to see that we call them back for a special session, hope to see some of these reforms, and none of the reforms made it through. Granted, we did get a few things. There were a few things that made it through the special session, a decent amount, and the Senate did a great job getting all these things through, but it's frustrating to see a lot of these issues that had a groundswell of support from the grassroots and from other folks just die, just didn't even stand a chance in the House.
So this has kind of escalated the Strauss-Abbott confrontations now?
I think so. Leading into this special session, it was interesting because Abbott has kind of always been, I wouldn't say soft-spoken, but he hasn't directly came out and said, Strauss is a problem or anything like that. But ahead of the special session, he was naming names and saying that Strauss is the one who stood in the way of his agenda, and he's calling them back because he wants them to vote on this. And even after the special session, he said something really recently, probably like a day or two ago, where he said that legislators aren't sent to Austin to hide behind parliamentary procedures and kind of these other tricks that are played in the House. They're there to vote on things. They're not there to be protected. And after all of this kind of back and forth between the House and the Senate, and Lieutenant Governor Patrick and Strauss and Governor Abbott and Strauss, and all this back and forth, it actually forced people to realize that Strauss is a problem. And it took a long time, I think, to get to that point, because you go to executive committee meetings for county Republican parties and things like that, and you still have a lot of people who support Strauss and think he's kind of doing the will of the body. But I think people are starting to realize that no, he's standing in the way of the will of the body and the will of the grassroots. And what's really interesting is that they kind of came out, and even after the special session, Patrick held a press conference, and Abbott's been making the rounds on the news and everything, talking specifically about Strauss, saying that he stood in the way of this agenda. It was his fault. Everything kind of lies at his feet, and they forced the Texas Freedom Caucus forced a Republican caucus meeting the day after special session ended, so Wednesday, to kind of revise the rules on how they're going to select a new speaker, because they're so frustrated with seeing that the reforms that they're pushing, that they've been elected to push, are dying. And it's not even just the reforms, it's that, a lot of times they get up there to speak and they ask to be recognized for something, or they ask to make a motion, and they're denied. And that's their right as members of the Texas House. It's their right to get up there and do those kind of things, just those procedural things, and they're just denied, they're silenced, and they're frustrated with it. And I think a lot of people are finally starting to see that, and hopefully that ground. I mean, we've been kind of keeping track of all these county Republican parties that have passed resolutions against Strauss, and I think it's somewhere, we're past 20 now. I mean, granted, Texas has, I think, 254 counties, so it's a long way to go, but a lot of counties have passed resolutions condemning Strauss, censuring Strauss, calling for a new speaker, because they're frustrated. They're sick and tired of seeing the items that they want passed die because he won't even let them get a hearing.
He is a nice guy, isn't he?
Yeah, all right. Well, that's an interesting update for all of us from Austin. There's another issue that seems to be boiling on the certainly on the media front these days, and certainly one that the media has tried to drag President Trump into as well. And that's the issue of the, I guess, you know, I'm not even sure it's the real issue, but it's been painted as one of the causes of the issue. And I'm speaking of the violence in Charlottesville, Virginia this past weekend, was about Confederate statues, or statues in, I don't know if statues in general or whatever, anyway, Confederate statues, which I guess had to do with a statue in Charlottesville. I guess it was a Robert E. Lee statue that were scheduled to come down, and there was people protesting the fact that it shouldn't come down, and people protesting the fact that it should come down. But anyway, and also I guess in Baltimore, just yesterday or the day before, in the middle of the night, they decided to go in and take down a bunch of statues of Confederate heroes that were, and I don't know what they've done with the statues, but I thought there was a rather interesting suggestion in the Chronicle. I mean, if these statues are so polarizing to people, and they're in public parks, you know, we could, like the person suggests, we could put them in museums then. I mean, that's, it's history, and, you know, you don't have to, if people have certain aspects of the history they don't like, you don't have to necessarily rub it in their face all the time and, you know, put some other statue up. But is there something emerging in the city of Houston about a statue too, Don?
Well, Charles and I were at the city council together on Wednesday, or actually it was Tuesday during pop-off, and we had the local representatives of the Communist Party and the Socialist Party, and the who I see, and I like them both, are the Gorczynski twins. I think they're twins. In, you know, Democratic operatives suggesting that we need to take down a statue in Sam Houston Park, which is the little park kind of at the head of the Allen Parkway Trail, where the houses are, the historical homes are in downtown Houston at the corner of Lamar and McKinney. So we're kind of comes in there, right there at the freeway.
I'm not even sure I've ever seen that statue.
Well, you know, and that's a good point. It was really interesting. You saw this all over Twitter, all over Facebook. We've got to take down these statues for these traitorous people that, you know, turned on our government, and they're racist, and they're this and they're that. And I started to laugh to myself because I knew that the statue that they were talking about was of an angel. It wasn't of Stonewall Jackson.
Might have been a fallen angel.
Yeah, fallen angel, or a spirit, and it's called the Spirit of the Confederacy, I think is the name of it. And my wife and I were talking about it, and, you know, Rachel was like, well, where is this statue? And I said, honey, we ride our bikes by it all the time. And she goes, we do? And I said, yeah. And she goes, well, how come I've never seen it? And I said, well, because it's overgrown with trees. Nobody has been able to see it for years. It's been, you know, it's been there since 1908. It's completely overgrown. I'm betting Sylvester Turner had it cut back so where people can see it now. But and I actually think Sylvester Turner, well, I know Sylvester Turner doesn't want this issue coming up because it's not good for him, because it is going to cause a lot of stink for the HPOU union bond that's about to come up. But this, you know, depending on how the police department handles the situation, but Charles and I saw that there is a protest that was being planned on the left, and a group that, you know, was warning people, don't bring their children to this protest. Oh, really? It's a peaceful protest? Don't bring your kids? You know, it's not a learning experience. You're gonna, and so, you know, it's very interesting. You know, to me, I think it's certainly a democratic attack against the elected president of the United States. You can tell by the media pundits, the way they talk about it from the Democrat side, Donald Trump's a racist, he's this. I personally have known Donald Trump since 1987. I was involved with a business deal with him way back when, and I've known him and his family for a long time. I've never seen a racist bone in his body. I've never seen he or his family, participate in any type of activity that is being talked about today in the media. I mean, his daughter Ivanka is converted to Judaism. Her husband's Jewish, and their children are Jewish. And Donald Trump wasn't a racist when he was a Democrat, but boy, the second he became a Republican, he's a big racist now. And it's much the same of the party. If you think about the Democratic Party itself created the Ku Klux Klan as an enforcement arm to put down what they reviewed as the Republican Reconstruction of the South. And
they dominated the South for, 50 years at least?
A very long time. And, I've seen people they have said the wildest things the last couple of days, but I think in the end, it's going to be a healthy conversation for the country, because I think they're going to look at, the fact that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, appointed Hugo Black to the United States Supreme Court, who was the Klan's general counsel. That's always skipped over in the history books.
I bet.
And the other things that are coming out, a local writer was, telling me right before we walked in here that the Dixiecrats all left the Democratic Party during the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And I responded back to this person and said, well, if that's true, who in the heck has been electing Robert Byrd and George Wallace to office? Yeah. And knowing that that's also true of Senator Gore's father, he kept getting elected to office. This talking point that all of these racists left the party, the Democratic Party, and went to someplace else, it's just a talking point. It's just not true. They've continued to elect those people to office for years and years and years. And now we come down to this argument of the statues. And again, I think Donald Trump is going to wind up on top of it, because, the hypocrisy of the left is eventually going to end the conversation.
Didn't we have that same kind of issue go through the HBISD with the naming of schools? Haven't they changed the names of
yes.
whole HISD?
Yeah, they did. That was last year. About a year ago. They, got a lot of complaints. Well, I wouldn't say a lot of complaints, but they got some complaints, and were saying that they didn't want these schools named after Confederate leaders anymore. And the frustrating part is a lot of these schools were named after folks who did a lot of good work and happened to be Confederate soldiers, or and they went and renamed a number of them. I think I forget how much it cost per school, but it cost a lot of money, because they had to redo, kind of like band uniforms and football uniforms and names of the schools and plaques and all that
Stationery.
stuff. Yeah, and it cost a lot of money unnecessarily, and they went ahead and did it. And it's unfortunate they spend money on things like that when HISD has God knows how many failing schools right now.
Yeah, so, right, and our danger of
so where are our priorities, really? Yeah,
advisory board taking over the whole school
right,
system.
exactly. So where are our priorities? I mean, it's ridiculous. And I know, me and Don both heard when we were at council this week that a lot of the activists were also urging them to rename a lot of the streets in the city, because they were named after Confederate leaders and things like that. And I just, I think we let a lot of this kind of excitement surrounding all of this and anger kind of take over, and we shouldn't really be doing public policy based on anger. And it just, I don't think it's the best idea. And I don't have one attachment one way or another. I was born and raised in New Jersey, so I don't have a huge connection to this, but I do think it's a little crazy.
Okay, I think that needs to wind up our discussion for tonight. I want to thank you both for.
An hour?
They flew by, right?
We'll fly by.
I want to thank you both for coming on and sharing your views with us, and I hope the audience had got a thorough viewing of both the local issues and some of these other issues that we've gotten into. And I know you both are very knowledgeable and conscientious about following this stuff, and a lot more than the average citizen is. And so we appreciate you coming and sharing your time with us, and look forward to having you back sometime in the future.
Well, thanks for
forward
having me.
to it. Thank
Okay,
you.
good enough.